All right, ladies and gentlemen. So you've probably heard me repeat a certain mantra throughout the year, which basically went like this. The first time you read something, you read it with your heart. The second time you read it, you generally read it with your head. So before we proceed, I would hope that you at least read this once. Okay, and then I would ask you to read it a second time. The first time you read it might not be with your heart. This isn't love poetry, but you might look at it and go, I had a certain feeling about it. I kind of got what the author was trying to say here. I think I kind of know what's going on. You don't. And I didn't the first time I read it. It's just not how it works. Then you kind of relax. Maybe you wrote down some, introductory notes or some impressions. That's great. Maybe you stopped as you read certain sections and, wrote down certain, ideas. But you really have to read it a couple times. On the AP exam itself, there's no way you can do that, right? You're going to have 45 minutes, but you're going to scour it. You're going to skim through it. You're going to do an intense, quick read, and then you're going to go back. That's kind of how that works. So anyway, I hope you read it a couple times. That was a pretty long-winded way of saying it. What I always, urge you to do is to deconstruct the prompts. And I talked about that throughout the year, and I talked about it in our last little video. But you come up here, and you're going to get a little bit of background, right? You get some historical background. You get a time window when Abigail Adams was alive. You get the general context of this letter. If you want to underline that, you can. I probably wouldn't. I would just make sure I paid attention to it. But then what I would underline would probably be, analyze the rhetorical strategies Adams uses to advise her son. And I might also underline, support your analysis with specific references to the text. Always want to avail yourself of every possible advantage and resource that is made, accessible to you. So you always want to use this prompt, this area, for whatever you can use it for. For me, I think it helps us approach the letter through a certain lens. Do we all walk around with detailed knowledge of Abigail Adams and her family's, detailed history and what their emotional connections were? And do we have a timeline of all their historical events? I mean, I don't. Maybe some of my colleagues in the history department could give you a very detailed account of those, but I don't really know. And you probably don't either, just going into, reading this. But what do I know going in? I mean, first of all, they provide a time window. And we can see that aside from the life window of Abigail Adams, we know this letter was written in 1780. It tells us that John Adams was a president of the United States. And we can pretty much draw, I think, a fairly useful set of, expectations and ideas going into the letter before we even read one line. And that's kind of what this prompt is all about. Yes, you want to underline the parts that have to do directly with your task that you have to actually achieve and what you have to do technically, but you also want to use it for any kind of insight into what you're about to read. Is it reasonable to assume that this letter is written within, the network of a principled family, right? Are they going to have high behavioral standards, right? I mean, think about it. It's a soon-to-be presidential family. You know that they're going to be affluent. He's a diplomat, right? So these are people that might not be the norm during this time period. I think it's reasonable to think that a letter from a mother to her son in this type of affluent, educated family, especially during this time period, is going to have some strict moral expectations. You're probably going to pick up on some strong values or sentiments coming through here. Is it a really strict family? Is it a stiff family? I don't know. You don't know. I mean, we could look that up, I suppose. But I think it's reasonable to conclude that, yeah, there's going to be a certain tone going in here. All right? Operating under the assumption that you've read this already, take a second and just look over that first paragraph. And can you kind of start to see perhaps a rhetorical situation coming into view here? Not to be guttural about it, but if I was going to translate this, again, let's pretend, God forbid, it's the AP exam and I'm going real fast here. And I have to kind of just read between the lines and kind of decode some of that real formal language. It sounds something to me like, hey, son, I want you to go to France with your father. He's an important man. He's a diplomat. And I want you to work. I want you to learn something. but kids, right? Uh, he probably did not want to go. Did she make him go? I'm going to say yes. I mean, listen, I don't know if she, pulled out a weapon and forced him into the cargo of a department of a ship. But yeah, I'm guessing, given the nature of this family, that there was a lot of pressure to kind of be a very loyal and obedient son to a mother and father such as he had. So that impression, I start to look at the language. Line 4, he had, quote, reluctance. Okay. Line 6, she urged him, quote, urged him to go. Line 7, he was averse, right? In strong opposition to. So we're seeing, very formal diction from this point in that first paragraph. I might say there's emotionally neutral or restrained tone coming from that very formal diction. Is there understatement? Probably. I mean, listen, we weren't there, but I think it's reasonable to assume that this was a very important decision and there was pressure and, there was a great deal of concern given just the profound importance that, the writer seems to attribute to what she's referring to later in this letter. So it's not sentimental writing in that first paragraph. It's sounds pretty official, actually. There's a lot of etiquette that could just be the cultural context from which it came. But if you look at, not to go too far ahead, if you look at just the first line in the second paragraph, we see that word submitted. Well, submitted, again, it's not very euphemistic. That pretty much means to surrender to the will of another. So we start to say, the language is very official and very formal, very, very civil, of course. But I think between the lines, we can kind of say, yeah, she pretty much made him do this. You're picking up on that impression, or if that makes sense to you. And I'm not teaching you how to write this. I'm modeling my thinking and just how do I approach these things. But if I'm thinking, hey, the dynamics between a parent and their child, that hasn't changed incredibly a great deal, right? Do parents still feel that they know more than their children? Generally, they do. Does this parent, Abigail Adams, is there a tone of superiority, perhaps, or that I know better than you? You could maybe use that word condescending. Based on that type of context, and you don't have to agree with that. That's just a way of thinking about it. Pulling certain words, some quotations out, I think you could make a fairly strong argument that initially that first paragraph opens up with perhaps a tone of superiority, perhaps a condescending tone, but one that is also, based on that formal diction, lacking in real overt sentiment, right? It's pretty non-emotional. As for myself, if I want to personally interact with this text and not just be purely descriptive, but really try to humanize this a little bit, I just, I try to reiterate the situation, right? What is that rhetorical situation? The mother of John Quincy Adams, she urges her son to accompany her, his father. Okay, so he does it. He goes. He follows his mom's advice, or she commands him. But could you imagine if you asked a friend, or someone you really cared about, right? Or you urge them, as the language in this document. Could you imagine you strongly, ask somebody or urge somebody to do something and it wound up hurting them? I mean, could you imagine giving advice to somebody and it turns out wrong, or you suggest an idea for someone you care about and it backfires and does something terrible? I mean, how would you feel if you were wrong and you did something negative to somebody as a result of your own confidence, right? You urge somebody into a bad position. I think you'd probably feel guilt or regret or remorse. Now, there's no evidence at all that there was a mistake made here. We don't know anything about that. I'm not saying Mrs. Adams made an error, but think of a mother's concern, right? It sounds like part of this might be her wanting to reinforce, to further support or justify the course of action that she, quote, urged her son to take. Is that the entirety of this? No, I think there's a lot more to this document, but I think that's a pretty good place to start, perhaps. It seems like she wants to further establish beyond the shadow of a doubt that she's right, that she's correct, and her wisdom is sound. So not only is that happening, but she has a lot more wisdom that she is going to relay, right? So in that next paragraph, take a second and, hopefully, again, you read this already, but go ahead and look at that. And I'll even read it because we're just hanging out here. You, however, readily submitted to my advice, and I hope you will never have occasion yourself, nor give me reason to lament it. Your knowledge of the language must give you greater advantages now than you could possibly have reaped whilst ignorance of it. And as you increase in years, you will find your understanding opening and daily improving. So, people, I'm no master of psychology, but it kind of rings with that feeling, that sensation that she's trying to convince herself or reinforce the usefulness of her advice almost to herself, right? I mean, your knowledge will give you greater advantages. It will, okay, right? This will increase. This will improve. Okay, I mean, who's arguing with her? It almost seems like she's just trying to confirm her own, you know, reasoning. Um, Take a look at line 10. Let's look at diction for a second. You will never have occasion. Well, that word never is pretty definitive. Look at line 12. Your knowledge of the language must give you greater advantages. That word must. I like lines 14 through 15 for diction. You will find your understanding. That is, I mean, people, 14 to 15, you will find your understanding opening and daily improving. That's actually a command. That's what we would call an imperative sentence, right? There are four types of sentences. There are declarative, which state like a third person observation. Mr. Kaleo taught the class. Imperative is come here, right? You will do this. Interrogative would be a question, and an exclamatory sentence would be, jump, run, whatever. So she's actually kind of commanding that. I would say, looking at, words like never and must and, you will, it's kind of, we're seeing a transition perhaps in that, around that second paragraph that you could argue occurs in the tone. We go from maybe an emotionally neutral or possibly condescending tone to now a tone of assurance or authority or seriousness. I think that type of diction, the connotations in those words, could probably build an argument that, there's a rigid adherence to one's beliefs. She's very firm in her belief that she is right. And this is pretty much where I'll leave you. So if we were in class, I would kind of get the ball rolling. Hopefully you'd take some notes and consider some of the things I suggested here. You don't have to follow what I said, but I thought it would be a nice place to kind of start. What I'd like you to do is take a look at that third paragraph and ask yourself, what's happening here? Lines 16 through 20, what do we call that? I mean, you can call it more than one thing, but what is that? And then lines 21 through 26, what is actually being compared? Because there's a comparison happening. So what I'd like to do, I'm not going to assign it on here. I'm going to put it on Classroom, but I'm going to give you a mini tiny little assignment where I'd like you to just give me a body paragraph just explaining what's happening in paragraph 3, right? Lines 16 to 26. And that way I can give you a little bit of feedback as you kind of work through the essay this week and next week. All right, people, I hope this helped a little bit, and have a great weekend. Thanks.